I want to come back to this point that we're talking about, that we're already living inside a system that is so complex we don't understand this, because, we program simulations, we program other things, but increasingly what it means is we're really living inside of this opaque simulation. And this will be even more true for our descendants, where they'll be living inside this world of a creation that they can't understand explicitly.
So Danny Hillis, the computer scientist, he has this great term where he talks about how we've kind of moved from the Enlightenment, this kind of age where we could take our mind and kind of apply it to the world around us and really understand it, to the entanglement. We've kind of moved to this area where everything is so hopelessly interconnected, we're never going to fully understand it. And I think we've been in the entanglement for quite some time. And it's really just a matter of becoming a little bit more aware of it. Going back to kind of the analogy of biology and things like that, with technology, and biology is a form of technology. Someone once told me that the way he kind of thought about it is like the most complicated engineered system that humans have ever made are domesticating dogs. Because like these are we made them and we evolved them basically through artificial selection, but they're an enormously complicated system. And I think that's those kinds of approaches, whether it's kind of like tinkering with systems, kind of evolving them, recognizing these things as enormously complicated, those might be the kind of approaches that we need. That being said, I would say one of the other things, though, that at least gives me a certain amount of hope, though that is kind of weird when you think about it, is that the extent to which humans are also really good at adapting to the world around us. And so we think about all the technological changes that have come over the past couple hundred years, and these things were enormously destabilizing, but in many ways, we kind of now take them for granted. And even like more modern ones. I'm not just talking about like air travel or certain things around the internet or the Industrial Revolution. So my grandfather, he lived to the age of 99. He was a retired dentist, but he also read science fiction since like the modern dawn of the genre. Like he read his entire life. And I remember, I think he read Dune when it was serialized in a magazine. So no story could surprise him. And I remember when the iPhone first came out, I went with my grandfather as well as my father to the Apple store to kind of check out the iPhone. And we're playing with it and looking at it. And he looks, and at one point he goes, "This is it. Like, this is the object I've been reading about for all these years." And we've moved though from like, oh, the iPhone is this object of wonder and science fiction in the future to like complaining about like camera resolution or battery life and things like that. Like we've so quickly adapted, which on the one hand is good and kind of gives me hope that we are going to figure out ways of adapting to new types of complexity. On the other hand, though, it means that we sometimes don't necessarily retain that capacity for wonder, or when it comes to complexity and the complex systems around us, maybe a more critical stance and actually saying, okay, what are the kind of systems we want to be embedded within? And as opposed to kind of just allowing them to kind of wash over us. But I do think that kind of adaptive capacity does give me a little bit of hope.
Yes. You probably know this routine from the comedian Louis C.K., where the first time he's ever on an airplane and they announce we have Wi-Fi in the airplane, and he's amazed. Everyone on the plane is amazed. They've never heard of this. And then 10 minutes into the flight, the Wi-Fi breaks. It stops working, and the guy next to him starts complaining. And Louis C.K. says, 10 minutes ago, you didn't even know this existed, and now you're complaining about it. So yes, it is true that we adapt so quickly to that. Okay, so let me ask you something really random. Given the evolution of the complexity all around us, what is your opinion on whether we are already living in a simulation?
For me, I like to think about it much more as if you kind of not necessarily take the simulation hypothesis seriously as this like question of great importance, but as like, a question that kind of leads me to think about more things around physics and computing, then I think it can actually be very productive. So the question becomes like, in the same way that people talk about the simulation hypothesis, there are interesting aspects around like breaking out of a computer program when you are inside it, or like the high resolution fidelity of computer games, or even just the ways in which physics and reality and computing intersect. Oftentimes when we think about computation, we think of it as this kind of like ephemeral information stuff. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about it. But the truth is, like computing and computers, like they are deeply physical. So the internet is not just information kind of whizzing around. it is kind of, to use the term from like that senator a number of years ago who was like widely mocked. Like, it is a series of tubes. And actually, there's a book called Tubes based on that, of like the physical infrastructure of the internet. Like, there is a lot of this physicality, and I think thinking about that, the physical nature of our computing, can be really powerful. And sometimes the simulation hypothesis, like thinking about it, can help heighten that, or can just make you realize, oh, there's some interesting bugs that are worth thinking about. So, for example, there was a story I read where I think it was like in some hospital, people noticed that iPhones stopped working when they were near one MRI machine. But it wasn't Android phones. It was like just Apple products. And it turned out it happened to be that some sort of switch or some other component within these Apple devices, it had some small enough gap that it happened to be this MRI machine had a helium leak, and the helium atoms were just the right size to kind of get into this machine, but didn't affect Android devices or other things. And so it was this wild thing that just brought home like the deeply physical nature of computing. And so for me, when I think about the simulation hypothesis, I don't think about it as like, oh no, like I'm being controlled by aliens or humans in the future or whatever it is. It's much more about, okay, how do I think about breaking open computer games, or like the deeply physical nature of bugs, and like all this, like that's the kind of stuff that I find most interesting about the simulation hypothesis. I also think about it as, for me, like, it's almost this like cry for myth in like in the tech world, where it's like, oh, like we're a deeply like the Silicon Valley world is like deeply rational, deeply logical, but we still kind of need some sort of myth or organizing story in our world. And the simulation hypothesis and ideas around the singularity, certain ideas around longevity or AI or things like, they often, and many times they're also based on technology, but when they kind of get big enough, those ideas kind of veer into kind of myth and storyland. And so for me, I view that as kind of, when people take those ideas a little bit more seriously, it's much more around, okay, fitting kind of a certain amount of myth into kind of that myth-shaped hole for those tech people.